The pluralist. So what motivated the pluralist? Well, essentially a problem. Our good dead friend Parmenides, the philosopher, not the cheese, showed that the assumption of a monistic worldview leads to the conclusion that the world is unchanging, and that sense experience is an illusion. So, faced with that logical conclusion, some philosophers decided to reject this in favor of pluralism. So if monism leads to the view the world is unchanging and sense experience is an illusion, which seems counterintuitive, to make a reference back to the appeal tuition argument back in argument basics, one solution would be to say, well, I'll reject monism, I'll accept pluralism, the view that there is more than one kind. One of the first philosophers to do this is, or rather was, because they're very dead now, Empedocles. Lived around 495 to 435 BC and was born in Sicily. So, what was his view? Well, according to him, at least what we believe about him, is that there can be no absolute creation or destruction of the world. So, world without beginning, world without end. And again, this is a common question in metaphysics and physics. Does the world have a beginning? Does it have an end? And also, does it have a creator or a creation scenario? He did believe that relative change is possible. So the world can't be destroyed or created, but it can change. Now, of course, as we saw before with the problem of change, in order for change to occur as opposed to destruction, there must be some things that remain the same. And the four permanent things he accepts will sound quite familiar. They're the four classic elements, well known through history, of course, but also in fantasy games like Warcraft, games like Dungeons and Dragons, and of course the Netflix series Avatar, was it Netflix? No, sorry, Nickelodeon. And the Avatar, The Last Airbender. And he had those four elementals, of course, being earth, air, fire, and water. The classic four. So he explains all change in terms of the combination and separation of these four elements. So everything is a mix of earth, air, fire, and water. So as a concrete example, bone, he actually had recipes for this. Bone would be 2 parts of earth and 2 parts of water plus 4 parts fire. So I guess you mix earth and water, add some fire, you get bone somehow. Obviously enough, modern science has shown not the case, but again, these are the beginnings of science and philosophy, so a lot of stuff is going to be wrong. Empedocles also embraced a principle of unification, and this explains how individual elements can combine to form unified objects. So what was his principle of unification? Interestingly enough, his answer is love. Love is a principle of unity. There's also the principle of individuation, because unification explains how they come together to form unified objects, and this principle of individuation explains how there are distinct entities separate from others. And this becomes part of the problem of universals, namely how do you have these distinct things separate from others? And the world for him is not a single entity, so it's not one thing, but rather it's composed of numerous individuals. And this is an ongoing question or problem in metaphysics. Is the world one thing, or is it a composition of individuals? The most extreme example of one thing that we'll see is probably our good dead friend Spinoza. We'll see him, in the future. And his view, spoiler alert of course, is that everything is God. It's all God. It's known as pantheism. So the view put forth by Empedocles is there is a world, but the world is composed of numerous individuals. So if love is a principle of unity, what is the principle of individuation? Well, his answer is strife. So two of the driving forces, or the two primary driving forces, would be love that unifies and strife that divides. And so the world for Empedocles is at an intermediate stage between complete unity and total separation. So is he an optimistic person or not? Well, he takes the view, and this is a question that, is discussed quite a bit, obviously, in politics and metaphysics, also a lot in, interesting enough, in fantasy literature. For example, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, the Lord of the Ring guy, addresses, kind of the question, are things becoming better or worse? And his answer is worse. The world is heading towards strife. Literally, things are becoming worse. And this is a common notion in political thought, although kind of in a weird way. The idea is generally you have this ideal past, things are becoming worse, and so one must try to return to that past. J.R.R. Tolkien, again, he had this notion of the idea being that the world was much better in the beginning, where you have the immortal elves, then you have humans, at the sort of their best, and then each succeeding generation is somehow lesser than the previous. Things are getting worse. And it was kind of a common theme in a lot of fantasy literature. The far, far past is the best, and things are getting worse. But also in politics. Now, although he describes forces as, deities, as, gods, he also takes them to be material forces that, in his quote, run through all things like Quicksilver. Not the Marvel superhero, but rather Quicksilver is just kind of a poetic term for mercury. Silver metal that's liquid at room temperature. Also super toxic. So what are some other views of Empedocles? Well, these thinkers, of course, do talk quite a bit about, whether space is empty or not, or, what is space. And the answer given by Empedocles is this: there is no empty space. How does this work? Well, for him, motion involves one material object moving through others. And so this is a direct contrast to the view that, the arguments advanced by Parmenides that you require empty space in order to have motion. There is no empty space, therefore there is no motion. To Empedocles' view that there is no empty space, but motion involves one material object somehow moving through others. So no empty space, but objects move, and they can somehow move through each other. He also presents a theory of sense perceptions, in which, here's how it works. Perception occurs when particles of matter come from the objects and strike the sense organs. Now, there's, as you might imagine, some debate about whether this is very, prescient, because this is pretty much the future conception of, or relative to Empedocles, our current conception of how senses work. That, light photons travel out, hit an object, come back, hit our retina, we get, experiences of vision, and we smell things because there are particles coming off things that get into our nose, and that's how we smell them. And so there's a question of, did he get this right on the basis of reasons, or was he just, kind of saying stuff and it happened to be right? Now, he didn't have a theory of, subatomic particles, etc. The idea was rather cruder than that, but it turns out that he kind of got it right. He also had a theory of evolution. As I mentioned before, with some of our other good dead friends, the notion of evolution didn't originate with Darwin. It goes way back to the pre-Socratics, perhaps earlier. Darwin, what he does is he actually develops a full theory of it, collects lots of evidence, etc. So what is his theory of evolution? Well, basically it's this. His claim was that nature produced creatures randomly. just combining them with all kinds of, weird parts. And the ones that, didn't work out would die off, and those that succeeded lived on. Which, kind of crudely put and oversimplified, is essentially evolution. The idea that, there's no design behind creatures, it's the ones that don't work perish, and the ones get selected for live on. And so they appear designed. So if you had like a cow with like little sticks for legs, they would just die. So you wouldn't have those. And cows that had, larger legs and could run away and stuff, they would survive. Now our next pluralist is our good dead friend Anaxagoras. He lived from about 500 to 428 BC, and he was born in Ionia, and then moved to the big city of Athens. And he joined the intellectual circle around the famous Athenian politician Pericles. He was also exiled from Athens. Unlike Socrates, who was killed in Athens, sorry, spoilers, he was exiled for teaching that the sun is a white-hot stone and not a deity, which is, in a way, kind of true. It is it's not stone, but definitely is, not a god, and is a sphere that's super hot. And again, there's a question of, was this the result of, good reasoning, or was it just kind of a lucky guess? Now, one of his other stories is this. There was a soothsayer, kind of like an oracle, someone who makes predictions. The soothsayer claimed that a one-horned ram given to Pericles would give him victory in battle. And Anaxagoras, kind of, spoiling things with science, dissected it and showed that a brain tumor was the cause of the missing horn, so that it wasn't any, divine sign, it was simply a brain tumor, which is kind of something that scientists and philosophers have been doing for quite some time, as one would say, ruining things like that. So what's his view of elements? Well, he believes that every kind has its own elements or seeds, and that everything is mixed with everything. So, pluralist. But what makes a thing that it is because a predominance of one element. So he has kind of this seed theory. To give a concrete example, he believes that food already contains the seeds of flesh, blood, and bone, and hair. This is how, according to him, eating food enables people to grow and stay alive. Grass, for example, in his view, contains the seeds of milk, which is how cows are able to produce milk. They gather the milk seeds and produce milk. Now, on one hand, of course, today, we would consider this, silly, that food contains the seeds of flesh, blood, and bone, and hair, that grass contains milk seeds. But looked at another way, it is, not a stupid explanation, because if you look at the seeds in terms of, the components that are needed to make it up, it's true that food does contain the components that we need to make, flesh, blood, and bone, and hair, the proteins and nutrients and so forth. Likewise, in a way, grass does contain the raw components for milk, because cows convert the grass, the stuff they consume, into milk. Now, Anaxagoras also introduces the concept of nous, which is, the term for mind. This actually is, I think it still is, the journal with that title. So he introduces this notion of nous, or mind, as a source of motion and the principle of order. So mind did not create the world. So the world is not created by mind, but this mind is free, spontaneous, active, and all-knowing. So it has some of the qualities that are later attributed to the monotheistic, God, namely all-knowing. But this mind, at least on the descriptions, that we have, doesn't seem to be an incorporeal, non-physical entity. It seems to be a form of rarefied matter. So a material, a material mind? And this is a question that persists to this day in philosophy and science. Is the mind a physical entity or non-physical? And there's also, interestingly enough, debates about God, about whether God is material or non-material. And of course, the kind of standard, we'd say the general orthodox view is that God is not made of matter. He's supposed to be incorporeal. So, what is the importance of our good dead friend Anaxagoras? Well, he did fail to present a unified account of reality, but his failure led others to do so. His extreme pluralism seemed to lack explanatory value. Why? Because an explanation, at least on the general assumption, is supposed to simplify and unify, rather than making things more complicated. Now, his use of mind led to thought about whether matter alone would suffice in philosophical explanations. And one thing he does do that sets a kind of a bad precedent is he uses mind, this nous, as a kind of deus ex, God in the machine, to fill in the gaps when mechanical explanations failed. Kind of a philosophical spackle to or to fill up those holes. Now later, this became, once monotheism appeared in Christianity, this became referred to as God in the gaps. So when there are problems, say, with theories in astronomy, what they would do is say, well, God takes care of that to fix the problem. And a lot of the battles in astronomy, like in the Middle Ages and later in the Enlightenment age and Renaissance, was over, do you need God to fix things? And what people like Newton would do, when Newton was criticized, whenever he had a problem he couldn't solve, he would spackle that with God. And the term deus ex, the full term is deus ex machina, literally the God in the machine. And it was a kind of a thing used in Greek plays. Like if the story was all too complicated to resolve, they would have a god brought up onto stage through the machinery of the stage, and that would solve all the problems. So today, if you hear when people are criticizing a film or TV show or a story, and they talk about deus ex solves it, that's a criticism. It's basically a sloppy way to solve it. Something super powerful shows up and just solves the problem, or it's just fixed without like a really good story resolution. So that brings us to the end of the pluralists. Next we'll move on to our good dead friend Democritus, but stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.